Imagine that you had one group of people who wanted to look at the layered and overlapping nature of racism in our country and issues of policing and economic justice, and another group of people who used their platforms to warn their followers against this examination because of an obscure ancestor's writings from 200-year-old political and economic theories that were horribly applied a century ago to devastating consequences that enveloped the globe. That's an actual scenario happening right now. There's a reckoning in North America about the legacy of racism and the ways that institutions and structures of power have been employed, like overlapping gears in a machine, to systematically recreate and reinforce the layered injustice and inequality that has resulted from the legacy of settler colonialism and slavery. One node of that societal web is called critical race theory, CRT, which examines the interrelated issues, exposes hidden mechanisms of power, and advocates for change. That's what critical theory is. Many evangelical leaders, however, are warning their people against CRT for the most obscure reason: Marxism. I want to be clear. This cynical slur is being used as a dog whistle. It's being employed to scare people because of its guilty by association nature of fear. Because communism, Soviet Russia, the enemy during the Cold War, Lenin, Stalin, the secret police and the gulags, millions dead. That's the slippery slope of guilty by association fear-mongering. But you can read lots of critical race theory, and for me specifically critical whiteness studies, without ever having to encounter Marx. It's such an odd objection. And if it were sincere and being brought up in good faith, I would want to be generous and ironic, like I usually am, in addressing people who are scared and in good faith are saying, we don't think this is a good thing. But however, it is not sincere, it is not being employed in good faith, and I will not be addressing it as a legitimate concern. So what is this claim of cultural Marxism and why does it work? So first I want to tell you why it's ridiculous, and then I want to tell you why there might be some utility in it. Why is it silly to keep bringing up Marxism? So here's an analogy. It would be the equivalent of me wanting to make a cell phone call and you constantly referencing Alexander Bell. So first of all, a lot has changed since the early days of the telephone. Secondly, I don't care about Bell. I just want to use a cell phone. But you keep taking it back to history and want to focus on the early design and the rotary phone with its receiver and the landline and how the cord used to get tangled around itself and operators. And that all of that may be really interesting, but I'm not wanting to talk about the history of the phone. I want to use a cell phone. It would be like if I wanted to get a burger at McDonald's and you got upset because in 1954, Ray Kroc started this hamburger franchise based on 6 that were in San Bernardino by the McDonald brothers. And you know how California is. So I would say, number one, a lot has happened. McDonald's is this global brand now. Why do you keep bringing up California in the 50s? Number two, there are a lot of concerns about McDonald's, like how they get their beef and how they treat their workers. But why do you keep bringing up Ray Kroc? And third, I just want to eat a hamburger. I don't want to know the history of the hamburger or the restaurant or the founder. That's the equivalent of what's happening right now. People who want to use critical theory, and specifically critical race theory, and evangelicals are bringing up Marxism in the Cold War. One group wants to use a toolkit called CRT to address a real live situation that's presently happening in our moment. And the other group wants to talk about origins and historical side effects of a remote influence in the field. Like I've said before, this charge of Marxism is a cynical distraction technique that is not being employed in good faith. It's a scare tactic and a boogeyman. Now, having said that, is there any merit to addressing this? And I think that there is. So Marx influenced the Frankfurt School, who popularized critical theory in the wake of World War II, and it migrated and evolved over the next 40 years into critical race theory, which has in turn adapted and evolved greatly over the last 40 years, including the integration of Foucault in the 80s and 90s, and then eventually the insights related to intersectionality and the multiple layers of overlapping and interacting levels of oppression and prejudice. So here are 2 points to consider. On the one hand, you have this massive lineage of an entire field that has evolved and adapted over the past 80 years. And so someone might say, who cares about a guy's writing who was influential on a bunch of guys who were influential in getting the ball rolling for a concept that eventually became the entirely different thing we're doing today? But on the other hand, that language of oppression and alienation has a genealogy and a legacy. So maybe the origin is important because the DNA carries through the generations and influences and historical transformations, mutations and adjustments and counter-corrections. Maybe it's important how something gets started because your ancestors' legacy lives through you today. Like it or not, you are a product and a result of those who came before you. You have inherited their legacy and are a result of their actions and ideas, beliefs and decisions. So let's give a little merit to these aspects of Marx's thoughts as they continue to influence or bear fruit in today's critical race theory. If we can decouple from the boogeyman of Marxism, then we can see something that's really important, which is cultural Marxism is a growing influence in North America. And I can point you to several great podcasts if you want to listen to them. So I will openly say that Marx's solutions were wrong, and their application was disastrous in totalitarian states. But that doesn't mean that his diagnosis with the problems of industrialized capitalism were faulty. His critique still has teeth. That is, again, not the point. Because that's not the part of Marx that critical race theory is utilizing. Critical race theory employs the legacy of his concerns about alienation and oppression and disparity. It continues his concern for emancipation and liberation for working class people, but it has broadened the scope of concern to advocate for the marginalized by exposing the mechanisms and structures within the system that keep them from the levers of power. That's why, for me, it's so important to decouple critical race theory from the dog whistle of Marxism, because those who want to examine the structure-rated nature of race relations in North America and the intersectional aspects of race, gender, class, sexuality, and, for me, religion, are not utilizing the same part of Marx that led to communism, Soviet Russia, enemy of the Cold War, Lenin and Stalin, secret police, the Gulag, millions dead. Different parts. But admittedly, there are those who are currently employing Marx politically. There's no doubt about that. But that's why it's so important not to let the specter of Marx be used as a scare tactic and a dog whistle and a boogeyman by evangelical leaders to scare people away from examining the very real concerns about the structure-rated nature of race in this country. So why are the evangelical leaders so concerned? Well, I think that there's a lot of confusion within evangelicalism right now. There's a generational crisis with a loss of people like Billy Graham who provided leadership, and now we have Franklin. The attrition of our young people that used to be for liberal and mainline churches a real problem has become an evangelical problem in the last 15, 20 years. There's a political crisis with white evangelicals supporting Trump at an oddly disproportionate rate. There's some real self-examination going on. There's an economic crisis with many of their colleges and seminaries being unsustainable and not being financially viable anymore. There's a cultural crisis with this century-old subculture that they've created, and the siloing has become so profound that it's become insular and fearful. There's an eschatological crisis about the end times, and this much-anticipated second coming of Christ appears to be waning in popularity, and it's compounded by the rapid loss of the generation that saw the founding of the nation of Israel as a major cornerstone of biblical prophecy. So with all of that going on, generational, political, economic, cultural, and doctrinal, you don't also want to be dealing with issues of race and racial disparity. Critical race theory and post-colonial theologies are unwelcomed intrusions into your already unstable house. That's my theory anyway, and I could be wrong, admittedly. Maybe they are genuinely intimidated by cultural Marxism and maybe a little naive about critical race theory, and thus they're justified in their concerns and they're sincerely confused. So I hope that this was helpful. I would love to get your thoughts. Please help me think through maybe what the next video should be in addressing these concerns, because this is a growing conversation and the pushback is profoundly forceful right now.